The cuts were supposed to save money. They didn't. In fact, some of the most aggressive reductions to American scientific research over the past few decades may have become some of the most expensive decisions the country ever made. Not expensive in the way politicians usually measure things. Not expensive because of next year's budget deficit. Expensive because every laboratory that closes, every research program that shrinks, and every young scientist who decides to leave creates a vacuum. And history has a habit of filling vacuums. China noticed. That may be the most important part of this story. While Washington spent years arguing over whether public research spending was too costly, Beijing came to a very different conclusion. Chinese planners looked at laboratories, engineering schools, semiconductor research centers, advanced materials institutes, and artificial intelligence programs, and saw something else entirely. They saw leverage. The result is that one of the biggest shifts in global power over the last 20 years did not begin with aircraft carriers, trade wars, or diplomatic summits. It began with research budgets. And the consequences are showing up everywhere. In the phones people carry, in the batteries inside electric vehicles, in the race for artificial intelligence, in advanced manufacturing, even in areas that most people never think about until they suddenly become critical. Because scientific capacity is a strange thing. You can spend decades building it. You can weaken it surprisingly fast. Then, one day you discover that rebuilding it is far harder than you imagined. A report from the U.S. National Science Foundation recently highlighted a trend that would have seemed almost impossible a generation ago. China now produces more science and engineering graduates than the United States by a massive margin. The gap isn't small. It isn't narrowing. It is large enough to influence entire industries. That statistic by itself doesn't determine who wins the future, but it tells us something important. One country has been expanding its technical workforce at extraordinary speed, while the other has spent years debating whether investments in research are worth making at all. The debate itself reveals the problem, because research is one of the few activities where the most important returns often arrive 10 or 20 years later. Politicians think in election cycles. Scientists think in decades. Those incentives do not naturally align. A new semiconductor breakthrough might begin as a laboratory experiment that appears commercially useless. A revolutionary battery chemistry may look like an academic curiosity. A breakthrough in artificial intelligence could start as a paper read by only a few hundred specialists. Then, 10 years later, entire industries depend on those discoveries. The people making budget decisions rarely receive credit for those successes, which makes cutting them politically easier. China understood something many Western governments forgot. Research spending is not merely spending, it is capacity creation. That distinction sounds subtle. It isn't. A country that builds scientific institutions is creating future options. A country that gradually weakens them is quietly reducing its own room to maneuver. The irony is almost painful. Many American laboratories and universities helped train generations of scientists who would later contribute to China's rise. The United States built some of the world's finest scientific ecosystems, then increasingly treated them as costs to be managed rather than strategic assets to be expanded. Meanwhile, Beijing looked at those same ecosystems and decided to replicate them at scale. Not perfectly, not without waste, not without mistakes, but relentlessly. There is a reason Chinese research parks kept appearing while American debates kept returning to austerity. One side was thinking about quarterly budgets, the other was thinking about 2040. And before we can understand how large that difference became, we need to examine a question that rarely gets asked. How exactly did the world's leading scientific superpower begin stepping away from the system that made it one in the first place? The story usually gets told backwards. People look at China's growing technological strength and assume it began with factories, rows of assembly lines, cheap labor, export-led growth. Those things mattered, but they weren't the foundation. Factories can assemble products. Laboratories create industries. The distinction becomes obvious when you look at what happened after China's leadership launched the Medium and Long-Term Plan for Science and Technology Development in 2006. It wasn't a flashy document, no dramatic speeches, no headlines that dominated Western newspapers. Yet it outlined something remarkably ambitious. China intended to reduce dependence on foreign technology and build domestic scientific capability across sectors that would define future economic power. Semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, quantum research, new materials. a long list of fields that seemed distant at the time but look very different today. Many observers in the West dismiss those plans as typical government targets. That wasn't entirely unreasonable. Governments publish grand strategies all the time. Most end up collecting dust. The difference was that Beijing paired the strategy with institutions, funding, and people. Lots of people. Chinese universities expanded engineering programs at a pace that would have been difficult for most countries to replicate. Research parks multiplied. State-backed funds directed capital towards strategic technologies. Local governments competed to attract laboratories and industrial clusters. Not every project succeeded, far from it. Some investments produced little more than expensive buildings and optimistic press releases. China is not immune to waste. No country is. But when you're making thousands of bets simultaneously, a surprisingly large number eventually work. That's where the American discussion often misses something important. Innovation is usually portrayed as a series of brilliant breakthroughs created by exceptional individuals. Reality is messier. Innovation behaves more like an ecosystem. Scientists train students. Students become researchers. Researchers launch companies. Companies create suppliers. Suppliers create specialized expertise. The ecosystem compounds. Once that process gains momentum, it becomes difficult to stop. And once it stops, restarting it becomes difficult. A useful example comes from solar technology. For years, American and European firms were leaders in solar innovation. Many of the foundational technologies emerged from Western laboratories. Yet today, China dominates much of the global solar manufacturing chain. Not because Chinese scientists invented every component. Not because Western researchers suddenly became less capable. Because China built the industrial ecosystem required to scale discoveries into production. Research and manufacturing reinforced one another. One generated ideas, the other improved them, round and round. Eventually, the gap widened. There is a dry joke buried in this story. Western governments often funded the invention stage, then seemed surprised when someone else dominated production. It's a bit like paying for the blueprint and then acting shocked when another country builds the house. The same pattern appeared in batteries. The same pattern appeared in critical minerals processing. Increasingly, it is appearing in advanced technologies linked to artificial intelligence. Yet this isn't simply a story of Chinese competence. It is also a story of American choices. During the decades following the Cold War, many policymakers assumed technological leadership was permanent. That assumption quietly influenced decision-making. Research budgets became easier targets during fiscal disputes. Manufacturing capacity was viewed as less important. Supply chains stretched across continents because efficiency mattered more than resilience. For a while, the model seemed to work. Consumers benefited from lower prices. Corporations improved margins. Financial markets were happy. Then, reality introduced a complication. Strategic industries do not care about quarterly earnings reports. Semiconductor shortages demonstrated that. Medical supply shortages demonstrated that. Energy shocks demonstrated that. Suddenly, capabilities that had looked old-fashioned became critically important. And that brings us back to something we touched on earlier. Scientific strength is not merely about publishing papers or producing graduates. It is about preserving options. A country with deep technical capacity can respond when circumstances change. A country without it discovers that rebuilding expertise takes years, sometimes decades. The question isn't whether America still possesses world-class scientists. It absolutely does. The question is whether the institutions surrounding those scientists remain strong enough while China was constructing an entirely new generation of research infrastructure. Because when we examine what happened inside fields like semiconductors, the picture becomes much more complicated than either side likes to admit. And that's where this story takes an unexpected turn. Remember that assumption we talked about earlier? The belief that American technological leadership was permanent? This is where that assumption collides with reality. Because if you look closely at the semiconductor industry, the industry's industry, the one that sits underneath AI, defense systems, smartphones, cloud computing, and modern manufacturing, you find a story that doesn't fit neatly into anyone's preferred narrative. The United States did not suddenly stop innovating. Far from it. American companies still dominate critical parts of the semiconductor ecosystem. Firms like Intel, NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm, Applied Materials, Lam Research, and countless specialized suppliers remain enormously influential. The world's most advanced chip design software is largely American. Many of the industry's most important patents are American, which raises an obvious question. If the United States still possesses so much technological strength, why has Washington become increasingly concerned about China's progress? Because leadership and dominance are not the same thing. A country can remain the leader while simultaneously losing ground, and that is exactly what happened in several strategic sectors. Take manufacturing capacity. In 1990, the United States produced roughly 37% of the world's semiconductors. Today, that figure is dramatically lower. The design expertise remained. Much of the production moved elsewhere. The logic seemed sound at the time. Manufacturing could be outsourced. Research and high-value work would stay at home. Everyone would benefit. Until policymakers realized that advanced manufacturing isn't just production, it's knowledge. Engineers learn by building things. Factories generate technical expertise that doesn't always appear in academic journals. When production moves, some of that expertise moves with it. Quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. Then one day, you discover that rebuilding it requires far more than writing a check. China understood this earlier than many expected. Its leadership wasn't trying merely to buy technology. It was trying to create technological ecosystems. That's a harder task, but a more durable one. Programs like the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, often called the Big Fund, directed tens of billions of dollars toward semiconductor development. Chinese provinces launched their own initiatives. Universities expanded specialized engineering programs. State-backed firms pursued expertise wherever they could find it. Critics point out, correctly, that many of these efforts underperformed expectations. Some projects failed completely. Several became corruption scandals. Money alone doesn't create innovation. If it did, every government would be a technological superpower. Yet focusing only on those failures misses something important. China didn't need every investment to succeed. It needed enough successes to move the frontier forward, and over time, some did. Then came the reversal, the moment that forced many analysts to rethink their assumptions. In October 2022, the United States imposed sweeping export controls designed to restrict China's access to advanced semiconductor technology. The strategy had a clear logic behind it: slow China's progress by limiting access to critical equipment and expertise. Many observers expected China's development to stall. Instead, something more complicated happened. The restrictions created pressure. Pressure created urgency. Urgency accelerated domestic investment. This doesn't mean the controls failed. That's too simplistic. China still faces significant obstacles in advanced chip manufacturing. The technological challenges are real. But the sanctions revealed something many people underestimated. China's scientific ecosystem had become far stronger than outsiders believed. When Huawei released advanced smartphones containing domestically produced chips, the reaction in Washington was not panic. It was surprise. And surprise is rarely a comfortable emotion in geopolitics, especially when it involves technologies considered strategically vital. I think this is where both sides often get the story wrong. Some commentators portray China as unstoppable. Others insist its achievements are exaggerated. Neither position survives serious scrutiny. China has genuine weaknesses: demographics, debt, inefficiencies, and political constraints. The United States still possesses extraordinary advantages: elite universities, venture capital networks, world-class firms, and a culture that remains remarkably innovative. But the competition itself reveals something deeper. The real issue isn't who has the better scientists. It's who is building stronger institutions around those scientists. Because scientific competition isn't a boxing match with a single winner. It's more like a marathon where the route keeps changing. And when we zoom out beyond semiconductors, beyond research budgets, beyond even China and the United States themselves, a much larger question begins to emerge. What happens when one nation stops assuming the future belongs to it, and another starts acting as if it can build that future from scratch? There is a temptation to turn this story into a scoreboard: America versus China, winner versus loser, decline versus rise. It's a satisfying narrative. It's also incomplete. Because the deeper lesson isn't about which flag ends up attached to the next breakthrough. The deeper lesson is about how civilizations maintain technological momentum and how easily they convince themselves that momentum is permanent. History is littered with countries that believed their advantages would last indefinitely. Spain believed its wealth would endure. Britain assumed industrial supremacy would continue. The Soviet Union looked immovable until suddenly it wasn't. None of those systems collapsed overnight. They drifted. Small decisions accumulated. Warning signs were rationalized. Capabilities eroded faster than people realized. Then the gap between perception and reality became impossible to ignore. That doesn't mean America is headed toward the same fate. I don't think the evidence supports that conclusion. In fact, one of the most interesting developments of the past few years is that Washington appears to have recognized the problem. The CHIPS and Science Act, renewed industrial policies, efforts to expand domestic semiconductor manufacturing, and growing investment in strategic technologies all point toward a significant shift in thinking. For the first time in decades, policymakers are talking openly about industrial capacity, scientific research, supply chains, and national resilience. Topics that once sounded unfashionable suddenly became priorities. The irony is hard to miss. Many of the ideas being discussed today would have seemed obvious to Cold War-era planners. A nation competing for technological leadership should probably invest heavily in science. A country dependent on advanced manufacturing should probably maintain some manufacturing. A government concerned about future prosperity should probably support the institutions that create future industries. These are not radical concepts, yet for years they were treated as optional. China, meanwhile, is entering a more difficult phase. Its growth is slowing, its population is aging, debt burdens are becoming harder to ignore. The easy gains from catching up with existing technologies are largely behind it. The next challenge is harder. Leading is more difficult than following. Inventing is more difficult than adapting. Maintaining momentum is more difficult than building it, which means the future remains far from settled. Anyone claiming certainty about how this competition ends is selling confidence they haven't earned. Still, if I had to make a prediction, I'd stake it on this. The defining economic competition of the next 20 years will not be determined primarily by tariffs, sanctions, military posturing, or diplomatic speeches. It will be determined by institutions. Research laboratories, universities, engineering schools, advanced manufacturing facilities. The boring things, the things that rarely trend on social media, the things politicians struggle to turn into campaign slogans. And yet those institutions quietly determine which countries create the technologies everyone else eventually buys. Remember where we started. Budget cuts, austerity, laboratories. What looked like accounting decisions were actually strategic decisions. Some people recognize that. China certainly did. While much of the world argued about whether scientific investment was affordable, Beijing treated scientific capacity as national infrastructure, not unlike ports, railways, or power grids. That doesn't mean China got everything right. It didn't. It means it understood the game being played, perhaps earlier than its competitors. The question for the United States isn't whether it can recover lost ground. It can. The country still possesses extraordinary strengths, extraordinary talent, and extraordinary resources. The real question is whether it can sustain attention long enough to rebuild what takes decades to create. Because scientific leadership isn't inherited, every generation has to earn it again. And if there's one lesson running through this entire story, it's that laboratories are rarely just laboratories. They're time machines. The money goes in today, the consequences arrive 15 years later, sometimes as prosperity, sometimes as dependence, and occasionally as a surprise that changes the way a nation sees itself. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe and come back for the next one. There are a few more assumptions about global power that deserve a much closer look. After all, the future has a habit of arriving long before governments finish debating it.